So in the previous video, I covered Achtung Cthulhu 2D20 Player's Guide by Modiphius, a book that tells you everything you need to know about the game's mechanics and all the playable characters and allied factions available. That book is very tight-lipped about the details of the enemy factions and really only offers a handful of spells. This book, the Gamemaster's Guide, goes absolutely overboard with details. Whereas the Player's Guide runs 191 pages, the GM's Guide runs 271 pages. And although there is a small amount of redundancy with some of the setting and metaplot details, it's a pretty close to flawless presentation of Lovecraftian Mythos World War II, and certainly the prettiest version of the game to date. Modiphius sent me the Exarch edition, which I showed in the previous video. Long story short, it's the leatherette, foil debossed, stitch-bound edition that contains both the Player's Guide and the GM's Guide in one. It's a glorious artifact to hold in one's hand. Whatever print shop Modiphius used to pump these leather-bound editions out is just operating at peak quality. But under normal circumstances, you would get this game as two separate books. So just to kind of catch you up, Achtung Cthulhu 2D20 is the latest version of Achtung Cthulhu that uses Modiphius's favored proprietary 2D20 system. The underlying setting itself is basically Cthulhu Mythos during World War II, with a heavy emphasis on US and UK forces versus Nazis and Mythos creatures. It's focused on 6 major factions, half of which are the good guys and the other half of which are the bad guys. The first of these factions is Section M, the secretive paragovernmental British organization that feels a lot like the BPRD from Hellboy. There are a lot of details about the history of this and all of the factions in the setting, which is loaded with metaplot. That is, there are a lot of things that have already happened and are clearly stated in the history of the setting. The aim of Section M is to defend against and ultimately take down the 2 occult organizations within the Nazi regime, the Black Sun and Nightwolf. To do so, it employs magical and occult research, as well as grassroots espionage and sabotage. Basically anything to win the so-called secret war, with skirmishes occurring in every corner of the globe as the Nazi occult factions search high and low for precious Blower crystals, these darkly magical minerals that give armor and ammunition eldritch power. Majestic is the American counterpart to Britain's Section M and have largely the same goals. It's written here that Majestic, quote, uses American ingenuity to fuse together a powerful combination of firepower and technology, mixed with courage and tenacity, whilst drawing on new developments in psychic and ESP research. The history is insanely detailed, almost to the point where I think its usefulness to a GM is a bit questionable. But a lot of the details at the highest level are important, such as how Majestic is organized and run. It basically runs on 3 kinds of operations: lone wolf operations, general assignments, and dedicated specialist missions. There are details about a few specialized units within the faction, such as the Tlingit warriors, called Pathfinder Demon Hunters. Tlingits are the indigenous peoples of present-day Alaska and the nearby region, and I think the author wanted to pay some homage to the contributions of indigenous peoples to the American war effort. There are 5 Majestic bases detailed, and they are kind of painted with a medium-sized brush. More than a sentence, but still leaving a lot of details unsaid for the GM to fill in. Black Sun is the Nazis' first of 2 Mythos occult factions, and it was founded by the so-called Exarch Reinhard Weissla. As the story goes, Weissla was a devotee of sorcery and at one point discovered an aspect of the god Yog-Sothoth imprisoned in the Dreamlands, an extra-dimensional plane. He vowed to free the deity and unleash it upon Earth, which is essentially an apocalypse that he wants. To achieve this goal, he uses Hyperborean magic and all manner of foul sorcery. His biggest means to achieve his ends is to find and research the Blower crystals scattered about the globe. The second Nazi occult faction is Nachtwolf, founded by an ageless witch named Mina Wolf. She worked under Weissla for a while, but opposed his goal of freeing Yog-Sothoth, and betrayed him by starting her own powerful occult faction that garnered support from Hitler himself. Her goal is to find the Blower crystals and to build up a heinous army to dominate over the good guys, but has developed her own distinctive weaponry and fighting force to do so. There are 2 monster factions in the game, and the first of these is the Deep Ones, which you may recognize from the Lovecraft classic, The Shadow over Innsmouth. If you're not familiar, Deep Ones in the extended lore are an ancient Earth native race of marine creatures who worship Cthulhu through subdeities Father Dagon and Mother Hydra. For millennia, they have bribed isolated human coastal communities with treasures from the sea into interbreeding and maybe a little bit of human sacrifice. The breeding results in fish-people hybrids, but otherwise the Deep Ones are full-blown fish folk who, in this setting, wage open warfare with the humans and use things like pufferfish grenades and mollusk mines, like something out of a dark episode of SpongeBob SquarePants. The second of two major monster factions is the Mi-Go, which also stemmed directly from a classic Lovecraft story, The Whisperer in the Darkness. Mi-Go are an extraterrestrial race of fungi-based lifeforms who invaded Earth millions of years ago. They most immediately came from Pluto, or Yuggoth as it's called in the lore, but their deepest origins are possibly from another star system or galaxy or dimension. Mi-Go are big into research and experimentation, but they are ruthless and not to be trusted. They're essentially at war with everyone, including the Deep Ones. I'll be honest, I sort of enjoyed reading through the setting history and details, but like I mentioned, I found it to be a bit dubious in terms of usefulness to a GM. At one point, the book just flat out says the Nazi factions are in fact defeated and to stay tuned for more Achtung Cthulhu game supplements to find out just how. It's weird. But the fact is, this book gets better and better as you keep reading, with each section becoming more and more immediately useful to a GM. This chapter on special weapons is pretty great, giving you weird arcane stuff like lightning guns, enzyme steam pistols, bizarre eldritch goggles, and Mythos entity detection devices. I would have loved to have seen more illustrations of these devices, since each of the illustrations you do get are amazing. But even just the written descriptions of these weird objects seem to fit the theme of the setting. Again, I'm sort of reminded of Hellboy with that early 20th century wartime experimental weapons feel. A few of the items also have a distinctly early or mid 20th century British fantasy feel to them, a la the King's Men, like the sword cane and umbrella gun. Majestic objects are more straightforward military weapons and items, but they're fun too. The Black Sun faction has its own themed set of special items, all dark and devious. One of my favorites is the Bloodborne Dart, which implants a little egg that instantly gestates upon contact with the target's blood into a fully materialized Bloodborne monster. I'll get to show you what a Bloodborne looks like later in the video. They have a gas that raises the dead, and a kaleidoscopic piece of glass that can imprison a person, and life-sucking spears. Likewise, the Nachtwolf faction has its own variety of items, leaning more towards battlefield and conventional warfare applications. The Underseher Helm. Oh, by the way, there's a fair smattering of German terms in this game, so if you're not familiar with the language, you might have a tough time with some of these words. Anyway, the Underseher Helm gives the wearer binocular vision, as well as night vision, and the ability to see magically invisible creatures. Notably here, there's a whole section on body enhancements, since that's how Nachtwolf rolls. You have a choice of 12 different enhancements for enemies to use, each affording one mechanical bonus or another. I think these could also be given to PCs, but the GM should also include some kind of cost or drawback to having them, if only to make it narratively interesting. Die Drauga gas will fuse a bunch of nearby bodies together into a massive flesh monster, and Feuerflügel ammunition is both armor penetrating and incendiary and area of effect. Deep Ones get their 6 SpongeBob weapons here, although to be fair, they're super deadly. They're all just derived from underwater plants and animals, and I find that kind of hilarious. Their technology is so strange that there's a note in the book here saying that the items cannot be requisitioned by player characters. The Mi-Go technology is also off limits to PCs, not just because of its weirdness, but I presume because of its power. Included are some very handy charts here that list all of the crazy items by type, and you can see the amount of damage or stress, as the game calls it, that they can all do just at a glance. As I mentioned in the video on the player's guide, magic in Achtung Cthulhu is supposed to be rare, unusual, and dangerous. In this book, it's generally broken down into 2 kinds, battlefield and ritualistic magic. The bad guys in this setting derive a lot of their magic from the gods of the Mythos, and a good chunk of the spells are subdivided by the god from which they're derived. The first set of spells is listed under the Tome of Cthulhu, and here it is exclusively water-themed attacks. Naturally, these are used by the Deep Ones, with effects like calling up a vortex of water or compelling an enemy to walk to the nearest body of water and drown, or summoning a so-called Reef Breaker, a huge Deep One champion. The Grimoire of Nyarlathotep is more generically themed, with spells that call up a foul mist that delivers mental stress, or summoning a servitor overlord, or causing insanity. The spellbook of Yog-Sothoth offers teleportation, buffs, and some attacks. And then we get to the rituals. There are more than a handful of generic rituals that the book says players can use or derive new spells from. I actually think that these should have been included in the player's guide for that reason. The player's guide, if I recall, only has about 3 rituals. These are very much something the players should have access to in a Cthulhu-themed game. Things like banishment and commune with deity are some basic staples when facing off against Mythos horrors. Here's a full list of these rituals, many of their names making the ritual's effect pretty self-explanatory. Reading through these spells was not some incredibly novel experience or anything. I've seen most of this stuff before in Call of Cthulhu and other adjacent games like Delta Green, but they had to be included here to make this a complete Cthulhu-ish game, and I appreciate that. This main body of rituals is like the lingua franca of Cthulhu games and sort of defines a baseline look and feel. Naturally, players can stumble upon a variety of forbidden tomes and attempt to extract knowledge from them with a reason plus academia test. The attempts, of course, cause the PC stress, as well as possibly other things depending on which book they're reading. There are some new tomes listed here that I haven't seen in other Cthulhu games, and I appreciate that, but the general idea is always the same. Dangle the book in front of the players like a carrot and try to tempt them to study it. Then sit back and watch horrible things happen. By the way, since the Necronomicon is the most cited of the forbidden books in Lovecraft stories, it gets a little bit of extra attention here, with 5 different versions floating around, all in different languages. Likewise, the special rules attached to it vary depending on which version the PCs commit to studying. The Gamemaster section of this book starts with generic advice on how to frame an RPG story, then goes into a reiteration of the 2d20 rules as applied to this game, as well as some advice on how to handle gray areas like choosing difficulty, handling complications, and opposed tests. Basically, the chapter leaves no stone unturned. And if you committed to reading and studying this chapter of the book, you will essentially come away knowing how to run 90% of every Modiphius 2d20 game ever published, which is what they're going for, of course. They've created a rules ecosystem that is pretty overwhelming for new GMs, but once it's internalized, it's translatable to all their games. Of course, it's easier said than done when it comes to reading and learning all this stuff. It's a lot of information to take in. By the way, this book is littered with amazing illustrations like these, but they're all sort of shrunken down into these photo frames. I think the small size for a lot of these illustrations do them a disservice because you almost have to squint to see the exquisite details. I generally like the layout and internal design of this book, but the artwork really does take a backseat to the rigidity of the layout framework most of the time. The next chapter offers a fairly staggering list of generic and specific NPCs for GMs to use. They're largely broken down by faction and nation. The named NPCs also come with special mechanical rules of one sort or another, which I thought was pretty fun. Although I did find some of the special rules for these NPCs to be a bit overwritten, such as the first rule here for Peggy Walsh. That's quite a text wall right there for one little power of hers that may or may not come up depending on if she's trying to be stealthy. But generally speaking, this is an excellent NPC section with a lot of really fun and varied enemies who bring the theme to life with their spells and abilities. Right here is one of the big bads of the setting, by the way, Reinhard Weissler. He's got a lot of details and special rules, of course. Actually, his big bad lieutenants also get a lot of love. They are some pretty formidable mini-bosses as far as the stats and powers go. I also think the Nachtwolf Stormtrooper is pretty notable. This is not your grandfather's Stormtrooper. There's definitely some Nazi power armor going on in this game here. If you look closely, you'll notice the armor is powered by one of those Blauer crystals that everyone is after. The other top villain in the setting is the head of Nachtwolf, Mina Wolf, whose special rules are few, but extremely potent. Getting to her would be the hardest part. The last, and in my opinion, most fun chapter of the book, in terms of creativity and novelty, is the Bestiary, which starts off with some regular animals like bears and bats, and the dog. Thank God they statted the dog again. They gave you the dog stat block in the player's guide, but here it is again. Let me know in the comments if you've ever actually used a dog stat block in one of your games, like a regular dog. Anyway, this chapter then goes on and gets into the good stuff. Die Drauga is one of those corpse beasts. And again, what an awesome illustration, shrunk down a little too small on the page here. Oh, and here's the Bloodborne I mentioned earlier with that blood dart that contains an egg. According to the lore, these are originally from the Dreamlands. There's something I want to mention here, and it's the amount of special rules for a lot of these beasts. Just check out the number of attacks and special features on this one so-called trooper NPC, the Bloodborne. It's a lot for a GM to keep track of. On the next page here, the cold ones have even more special rules. And mind you, these are not boss creatures, but some of them have as many special attacks and defenses as a dragon in D&D. I'm not entirely sure how a GM is supposed to remember or keep track of all these abilities, and I also kind of wonder if some of these enemies are just way too powerful. Like the Overlords of Nyarlathotep, for example. It's got 11 listed powers. It's immune to just about everything and can poison you, control your mind, shoot you with a machine gun, or throw a bunch of spells at you. Shoggoths are also sort of WTF for me. It's just a full page of special powers. My guess with this one is that since Shoggoths got a direct appearance in a classic Lovecraft story, they get super duper powers that go even beyond what Lovecraft himself ever intended for the things, probably. That's 3 attack types there, and a whopping 15 special rules for the Shoggoth. I think the objects of my greatest admiration in this chapter are the details of the Deep Ones and the Migo. You start off with Deep One hybrids and scouts, which I've seen a million times, but then the book further diversifies into other Deep One types, slavers, warriors, engineers, the hulking reef breaker, all of which have their own special rules, of course, but just a handful each. Then it goes even further into Deep One elders, shamans, adepts, warlocks, aquamancers, and finally a Deep One high aquamage. This is awesome. It's the first time I feel the Deep Ones are given a full spectrum military cast, and in effect, a bit more of a civilization or culture. They're not a sympathetic civilization, seeming hell-bent on subverting humanity at every turn, but it's still extremely satisfying to read this expanded hierarchy of Deep One types. Probably even more satisfying to me was all the different types of Migo listed. Usually all you ever see are 1 or 2 variants of Migo, but here they give you the drone, the augmented, the scientist, the centurion, the princess, and finally, my very favorite, the emerging queen. Again, the authors create a deeper sense of structure in society with a mythos entity, and it makes sense. If Migo are supposedly super intelligent and have been around for 1 billion years, then they're probably going to be composed of more than just 1 or 2 classes and phenotypes. The section on the Elder Gods, Outer Gods, and Great Old Ones commits the same sin that the OG Call of Cthulhu RPG does, and that's put hard stats and limitations on gods. Just right off the bat here, there's Azathoth, the quote, nuclear chaos, the beating, hideous heart of the universe, and yet, Azathoth has an armor rating of 5 and a courage of 10 and is vulnerable to magic attacks and has 30 hit points. I could go on and on about this, but I'm sure there are some good reasons for statting deities like this. I mean, it's a game after all, and the point is for players to have fun. And maybe having fun in some instances is facing off with a god and killing them. Not that killing them would be all that easy, to be honest. These entities are theoretically killable, but if you look closely at their powers, it's just not likely. The status invulnerable does get used a lot in this section. Alright, here are my thoughts on Achtung Cthulhu 2D20 Game Master's Guide. Cons. It's a bit overwritten. Like I mentioned, I think the meta plot overextends itself in predetermining how, when, and where the enemy factions are defeated. Some of these specifics will be included in future expansion books, but the message is clear that it's not your players who will defeat the bad guys in the game ultimately, it's other NPCs. And also in this vein, I found the list of special rules for a lot of NPCs to be crazy long. Artwork diminished. Some of the illustrations that were crammed into the small photo frames really should have been either zoomed in or featured across a larger area. Pros. Definitive mythos World War II. People have combined Cthulhu with countless other themes, but when it comes to Cthulhu plus World War II, this game just fills out that niche completely and absolutely. This book is an ultimate guide. If you consider just how thorough the GM section of this book is, along with the big fat list of spells and all the NPCs and monsters and special items, you have a fully polished, matured manual for a Mythos plus World War II game with virtually no blind spots. Presentation. The artwork, layout, writing, and chapter organization is absolutely spot on and first class. Collector's Edition. The Primo Leatherette Exarch edition of this game is a treasure to hold and would look amazing at a physical table. Yep, that's all I got for now. Links are below. Let me know if you've played Achtung Cthulhu in this version or any other, and let me know what you thought of the game. Thanks for watching. See ya.